it is my wife and I, Christian, she does a lot of the work on the trees too, so kind of a team effort on all of that. But the purpose of this talk is to go cradle to bonsai pot for newer people, but I think that everybody will be able to get something out of this talk. So the trees that I have here are meant to go from sort of the beginning stages all the way to the end. So I'll get going. And here's the topics we'll discuss. So why do deciduous bonsai, and then general deciduous care on the Front Range, and then winter care, because that's a big concern for us, and then species selection, and then having a vision for your tree, which will guide how you develop it, and then go into refinement. So why would you want to grow deciduous trees instead of other ones? Well, every type of bonsai has its own unique things that are really beautiful, but deciduous bonsai, what a lot of people say is they're an investment because you're not likely to see the same drastic changes that you can see on conifers and tropicals, just because they're robust in some ways, but in other ways they can't take that much work. So they're more like an investment account. You can think of them as a relationship with somebody or a career where you work at it slowly over time. You work at it a little bit, and then every year, every time you do a little work to it, it gets better. The other thing is that no other form of bonsai will exhibit the same seasonality as deciduous because you have flowers, you have the leafless silhouette, you have the changing color of the foliage that is much more extreme than in other forms of bonsai. So here's just a red bud I'm working on, and then that's one of Dennis Wojtyła's birch that won at the national show. So everything with deciduous, most of it started just like that red bud, because collection is also harder. Because deciduous trees, if the site's subpar, the seed's just not going to germinate there, unlike a conifer who will find germinating and struggling, for 100 years. So, general care. The dynamics of our weather are extreme here. As Josh mentioned, I've grown bonsai in 2 other climates, and this one is definitely the most challenging. So to start off with, I do recommend some sort of hail protection for your deciduous, because when you're getting started, you just have this little twig right here, and if a big piece of hail comes, then that's no good, right? It doesn't have to be very robust. So this is our hail structure here. It's just, they call it hail cloth, and then it's strung up on some EMT pipe, and that's worked pretty good. The other thing is, I've never lived anywhere where so many animals eat stuff. So I do recommend some form of animal protection. So we built a fence around ours, and the main problem we have is bunnies. We do have deer in our neighborhood, but we kind of live up on a slope, and they don't like to jump up. But definitely recommend something to protect them from being munched on. Especially the spring leaves attract a lot of animals, especially the bunnies. All right. Next, we're definitely subject to dry, sunny, and windy days, which can really dry things out. So one thing that comes to my mind when I think about this is in Oregon, everybody develops their deciduous in these net pots. And here they just dry out immensely quick because of the winds and stuff. So when my brother and sister-in-law were here on vacation, I was like, do you want to help me line 150 net pots with plastic? Luckily they did help, so that was nice. So we definitely have to keep more in tune with moisture. I've also found that I have to have a little bit more moisture retentive mix here than in the other climates I've grown in. So keep that in mind when you're looking at stuff on the internet and it's somebody in a wet climate, talking about a soil mix. That might not work for you. Another thing that I hear a lot here is that deciduous can't really take the full sun. We grow all of our trees in full sun, other than that hailcloth, which provides about 15% shade. The thing that really gets people is if you're growing a deciduous tree and it's in the garage and then it starts to leaf out, then it's not exposed to the sun, and really the environment is going to trigger how the leaf is formed. And I talked about this during my Nabari talk. And so what happens in those situations is the leaf will literally be thinner. It won't form as many of these palisade layers where the chlorophyll lives. And so it can get damaged much easier. So I think a lot of people say that you can't put deciduous in the sun here, is they're letting them leaf out in these, in their winter protection, and then they're putting them straight out into the full sun. And then it's not going to do so well because the leaf morphology wasn't built for the environment that you're putting it in. Other things change too. The number of stomata will be different, the thickness of the cuticle, the size of the leaf. So as much as possible, if you can delay the onset of leafing until the temperatures are good, or even treat them like a tropical where you have grow lights, just the same way when they start to leaf out. That will be very helpful. Let's see, fertilizers. So I definitely recommend water soluble here because it's so dry here that in my experience, the solid organic fertilizers don't really stay moist enough during the day to give up their nutrients, as I've seen in other climates. So even if you're using an organic, I definitely prefer water soluble. And for our trees, there's a lot of talk on like what fertilizer you use. For a decade, I've used Miracle Grow and just cut it to different strengths. And people used to, I'd ask questions about that, and they'd be like, "Why are you doing that?" And now it's slowly catching on. But this is what people do in other plant hobbies like orchids, carnivorous plants and stuff. They just cut the strength of the fertilizer to what's needed. And then you can gauge what's needed based on the development stage of your tree. So if you're all the way at the end of the table in refinement, you want to shorten your inner node. So then you just dilute the fertilizer more. We do cycle in other fertilizers though, just because I don't think one product has everything that a plant would need its whole life. So cycle in like Alaskan fish or something like that every now and then, but that's just a supplement. Let's see, covered everything there. So winter care. This is a tough topic here, and I've given a presentation at our Colorado Springs chapter on this. This will just touch the mountaintops of that. So roots don't actually develop the same level of cold hardiness as canopies. The root cold hardiness actually can ebb and flow much greater than a canopy, and roots can lose all of their cold hardiness in a single day, and they start to lose it at about 41 degrees Fahrenheit. And it can take them almost a week to regain it to the same level. And another thing that's tricky for our environment is that the cold hardiness is kind of on a bell curve, and it basically starts in autumn and basically ends in spring. So those late frosts that we get can be detrimental. So you do want to really be on top of those with your deciduous trees. Let's see. So the first thing that we can do to protect our trees, which I'm sure most of you know about, is mulching the roots. And a lot of that is it's as much about keeping the roots cold as it is warm, which a lot of times we don't think about, because you also want to keep the roots below that 41-degree threshold, because you want to keep your cold hardiness. So mulching is definitely important. Placing your trees on the north side of a structure also protects them from heating up a lot during the day, losing all their cold hardiness, and then at night, the temperature plummets around here. So that's why so many people talk about, putting the trees on the north side. That's what's pretty helpful. Of course, there's the wind protection and so forth. And it's not really detrimental to the trees. A lot of people think like, not getting any sun. Not much photosynthesis is happening at 32. And when we're in the dead of winter, most of the time in the shade, it's going to be under 32 anyway. So the trees pretty much shut down. Another thing that you can do is to protect your trees is put them on the ground. A lot of people should know or would know about that if you've been in bonsai for a while, but the ground temperature, according to the experiments we've done, is usually around 5 degrees warmer just being on the ground. And that's just because you have that thermal mass on the ground, and then there's also the wind speed is, when you get all the way to the ground on like a molecular level, is 0. So you're also losing less heat from wind. And again, your structures don't have to be complicated. So this is one that we have on Facebook Marketplace. Some guy was like selling his greenhouse and piecing it out. So we bought part of one of the hoops, and then we just cover it with tarp, and then that creates a north side structure. And then it also has another benefit I'll talk about. Another thing that can protect your trees, that is kind of a low-hanging fruit, is to put them next to your house, because your house is a heated structure and it will radiate heat. So we did more experiments about that, and at least our house, our situation, it'll keep your trees 3.5 degrees warmer, just for something that most people have. And it doesn't have to be a house. Like if you have like an apartment balcony or something. I lived in Oregon in an apartment, and I had like 50 trees, and I would just put them all against the window. So another thing, I hear this talked about less, but for protecting your trees is actually shielding them from the heat that they lose at night to the sky. And it makes sense if you think about it. The outer space is obviously very cold, much colder than even the coldest Colorado night. So it's absorbing a lot of heat from all the surfaces. So this is why if like the weather forecast says it's not supposed to freeze, and then you go outside and like all your water is frozen on every surface, it's because it lost heat to the sky. So if you can shield that by providing a cover, it's beneficial to your trees. And we did experiments on that too, and exposed surfaces are almost 15 degrees colder than ones that aren't. And so mulch can help with this too for the roots, but if you can provide some sort of cover in the winter, it's beneficial. So these are all kind of like low-hanging fruit things that most people could do to protect their trees. The next thing I wanted to talk about is in my Nabari talk, someone asked me what tree species we should grow here. And I kind of just said natives because Austin Heitzman was like waiting to present, and it was like an easy thing to say. But there's a lot more to it than just that. So what deciduous trees can we grow in the Front Range? Because it's kind of like been doom and gloom so far about this stuff. So there was some research done in the 1970s and 1980s that studied the root killing temperature of the tree, which is different than the USDA hardiness zone, which is concerned about trees in the ground. So if you've read Michael Hagedorn's book, he has a section on this. This is what he's referencing. His book has a small subset of the data that's actually available, though. So a full comparison of the deciduous data, comparing the root killing temperatures to USDA hardiness zone, that we have done indicates that zone 4 trees can survive here as long as you've done everything that I just talked about. Mulching them, north side, next to a structure, protect it from the sky. And here's just a list. Obviously, this isn't an exhaustive list of every species you could grow, but these are just several species of deciduous trees that I found respond well to bonsai techniques that meet that criteria. And the other thing is almost no tree can do well root-wise and survive once the temperature goes to 0. So even these trees, it's recommended to bring them in at 0 Fahrenheit. So if you see a night that's going to be 0, if you have an unheated garage, or if you don't have anything, just bring them into the house. And then obviously you could grow a zone 5 tree. It just means you'd be bringing it in at 10 instead. But zone 4 is what I would recommend. Okay, so now talked about how to grow them here. So now let's talk about the vision. So to grow a deciduous tree into a bonsai, you really need to have kind of a blueprint from the start of where you're going. So things to consider are, do you want the tree to be like a realistic tree? Do you want it to be more abstract? How big do you want it to be? And what kind of story do you want the tree to tell as well? Defining those parameters early with our deciduous will help us as artists make decisions of what to do to have a consistent view and to get to where we want to go. Because if you don't have a consistent view and you keep changing your plans every year, which is a big problem with deciduous development, you'll never get anywhere. You have to keep moving the needle in the direction that you want to go. So the first thing I want to talk about is in bonsai, just like in art, there's like an abstract style and there's a realistic style. And so you should decide what kind of tree you want from the beginning. And this is a spectrum because all bonsai are obviously abstractions. The tree right here on the left is a small tree that Matt Wright gave me a photo of. I don't know, how tall was that one, Matt?
Super small.
Okay, yeah, the one that it's next to is almost 4 feet tall. It's a Dennis Wojtyła maple. So one thing that you can see is there's no way that on that small, tiny shohin that you could get the same level of detail that Dennis Wojtyła's gotten in a 4-foot tall tree. So there's some crosstalk between the size and the abstraction. And in my opinion, this is why, like if you see a big tree, it has a lot more impact than a small tree, is because you can have so much more detail in a big tree than a small tree. And then here's just some things to think about abstract versus realistic. And there's not one style that's wrong. My hornbeam that I exhibited last year at the show, I would consider an abstract representation, and I don't plan to sell it until I have to, kind of thing. So I like those too. However, the trees that I've started from the beginning, I've kind of tended to enjoy the realistic style more. And I would say, in my opinion, American bonsai and definitely European bonsai kind of slant towards realistic. And then to me, Japanese kind of slant towards abstract and broad strokes. And one of the things on here, I talk about decurrent and excurrent structure. So conifers typically grow in what's called an excurrent pattern, where the central leader stays dominant all the way up. Deciduous trees, if you're going for a realistic look, they become decurrent. So their central stem will branch off into different ones. So this is kind of one of the, for me and my take on it, this is one of the first things that I want to decide for realistic versus abstract. You can see that the decurrent structure is more complicated though. So that's a lot of times why deciduous trees get abstracted to the excurrent structure, just because it's a little bit easier to execute. All right, so the size, we've already touched on it, but yeah, generally the smaller trees lean more towards abstract just because you can't put as much detail into them. But knowing the target size of your finished tree is probably the most important thing, if I would say, like having a consistent vision, because it tells you at what height you want your branches to be. It tells you what level of scarring you can afford in the tree. It tells you how tight your bins should be or how loose. So really deciding on the tree, you should try to decide that the first time you work on it. Just decide the height of it. And this also has implications to, there's, I don't put it on here, but there's size categories and shows. So there's I forget the Japanese word for it, but there's a word for trees that don't really fit the size category, and they're a lot cheaper in Japan because they're like a few inches too tall to be a medium tree, but they're not big enough to compete with the large trees. So just something to consider. Another thing to consider is how old do you want the tree to appear? Because one of our goals in bonsai is to create some image of age, but it's how much age. So that tree on the left is a bald cypress at the National Arboretum. It's 50. So, you know, it's older than me as the artist. So that's a pretty old tree. But it doesn't grow, it's not old enough to grow in the flat top style. Nothing's happened to it, hasn't endured any hurricane. So a lot of people say bald cypress, like, you know, right now I'd say it's dominant to style them as flat top, but they don't start out that way. They have to go through a lot of damage, likely be forest grown, and then they become flat top. So just something to think about, that the morphology of your tree can actually change with age. So it's not wrong to do a bald cypress more like a pine tree. It's just you're depicting a different age than somebody who's doing one as the flat top. There's other trees that will change as they age too. So it's something to consider when you're developing your tree. The last thing that I want to talk about with this is just what's the story of your tree, because it can guide a lot of deviations from how the tree naturally grows or the style that a certain species typically grows. So it's just good to have a consistent story in your head about why, like Zelkovas normally, they do grow like a broom style tree, even left to their own devices, but certainly something could have happened to one in nature where it's not growing like that. So it's fine to have a tree that breaks the mold. You just have to have that story in your head about why it breaks the mold. And you know, we as artists can decide why it deviates. Was it storm damage? Was it a ground shift? Was it growing next to mountain? We don't know. But we can decide because that's what makes it an art. So you use the story to create a coherent vision, and then it should always inform that while we talk about rules and guidelines, that trees don't actually know any rules or guidelines. They're just gonna grow and live. So they're not gonna be like, oh, I can't grow this branch here because I'm not allowed to do that. Another thing that this has taken me a long time to learn too in deciduous is they're tough in the sense that you can lose every single leaf on it and it'll come back. If you do that to conifer, it'll probably die. You know, and you could do that to tropicals, but I think with both tropicals and deciduous, there's this feeling that you can always start over. And that's detrimental in a lot of ways, because it means that if you adopt that mindset, you're not taking the story of the tree forward every year. And we just talked about it as like an investment account, at the start. Well, if you pull your money out every 6 months or something, it's never going to grow. You're just going to lose money. So deciduous trees are the same. If something happens to it and you have to deviate from whatever your plan is, you should first think about what can I do to keep this tree moving in the future. So that could be a squirrel ate off the lower branch. Well, then you just make it a bigger tree. That might be the move to do, versus like cut it all the way to the height that you wanted, which I've certainly done before. And that big trident maple there, the top was looking a lot better, but when I went on a move, my wife and I were driving on Garden of the Gods, and I thought it was only like 20-mile-an-hour speed limit, so open top trailer should be fine. The top snapped off, and that's what that scar is from. But you just move on, and sometimes it can be good. Like things can happen, and it takes your tree in a direction that's beautiful that you wouldn't have thought of on your own. All right, so now the techniques. So once you know the parameters, then you can start actually moving towards things. One of the biggest principles that I've learned is that you should really develop the whole tree at once. You don't want to just be like, oh, I'm just growing the trunk, and then grow the trunk, and then be like, oh, well, I don't have any branches now, so I need to cut everything off the top to get it to backbud. You want to be thinking through that process all along the way, and then that will help you create a consistent age throughout the tree. It's like if you've seen trees in Japan, like that's what they're amazing at. They're developing the trees by and large all at once. That's why the branches look just as old as the trunk, and that's why the roots, they're able to have these crazy plated nabaris, because they didn't start that tree, just be like, all right, I'm done with the top, I'm going to air layer it now. Like they might have started the whole tree as an air layer, but that was the blank canvas for them. It wasn't, let's start an air layer when everything else is done, because then your roots will never have like a consistent story. Or if you do it with the branches, your branches will never have a consistent story. You'll have like a trunk that's barked up, but branches that look brand new. So it's important to develop everything all at once. So I have a whole talk on nabari, so I think this is my only slide on it. There's a lot of techniques to develop nabaris. Just use one of them early on, use several of them early on to develop your roots. Don't make it an afterthought, because that's the foundation of the tree. That's what anchors it to the ground. And then especially on deciduous trees, that's kind of what they're valued for. Those roots there are that bald cypress next to the trident maple too. So for developing the trunk for most things is the next thing that we look at in deciduous. So the goals for trunk development are pretty simple in theory. We want to develop taper, we want minimal or no scars, we want some movement, sometimes, not all the time. And these are simple, but they also kind of have competing parameters. Like it's hard to develop taper without having any scars. It's also hard to have movement without having any scars. So to develop taper, there's a few techniques, so I'll talk about each one here. So one of the popular ways is they call them sacrifice branches. So those are branches that you grow on the tree simply to thicken everything below it, to increase the cambial growth below it. So they're a good tool. And why they're called sacrifice branches is because they're not meant to be part of the final design. They do come with some issues. We said one of our goals on the trunk development was no scars. Well, they directly contribute to scars. So here's the other side of that tree where I've done other sacrifice branches, and I have a bunch of scars from it. So if left too long, they will create inverse taper as well. So you have the scarring and the inverse taper. In some cases, I still like to use them, but I've kind of transitioned away. I like this method a little bit more, and it's called, I haven't heard what other people call it, but I call it sacrifice leader. So basically, you're developing the new leader while you still have the old leader on the tree. So you can see the red arrow is the old one that I ultimately plan to cut off on this crabapple, and then the one on the right is the one that will remain. Let's see. So because of the positioning of the sacrifice leader, it's almost always in the back. So you're always hiding the tree that way. And then because of how you slope the cut, it also introduces taper. So it's not hurting you directly as much as a sacrifice branch. And in fact has some advantages. So here you can see how just the angle of the cut created some taper in this bald cypress. So a final method that I like to use nowadays is sacrificial ramification. And that's where you have a branch and you keep on growing out one of the tips that you ultimately plan to cut off. So it actually aids in the development of scar tissue as well, which is helpful for making a robust design because scar tissue is where buds can occur later. It adds taper and doesn't add scars. So I think that's a good method to use. One thing is though, you don't want the sacrificial ramification to grow too long. This is a constant struggle in developing deciduous trees. If you let stuff grow too much, then it'll kill off all the interior buds. So I've kind of found pruning them back at least one time a year in midsummer is best, and then you get another flush of ramification that can harden off before autumn. And then a last note on building taper is that when you put them in a bonsai pot, you shouldn't rush them into a bonsai pot, but stuff will still thicken in a bonsai pot. So this is Dennis Foitia's hawthorn, and this one won Best Deciduous, I think 2022 or 2023, and actually it was a now pot. This one's not the now pot yet, but he potted it in a now pot that it won that show in. But he, when I've talked to him, he says that this tree doubled in trunk size in a bonsai pot. So just as he added more ramification, it did. Having said that, he said almost all of his trees, he wishes that he hadn't rushed them to a bonsai pot. And I would consider he's a very patient person. So I wouldn't have considered it rushed, but it's interesting that he said that. But yeah, so I was blown away when he said that tree doubled in size in a bonsai pot, or a trunk thickness. So now for the trunk movement. You can achieve it in 3 different ways. You can wire the movement on a young stem. You can cut to a new leader that has a direction change, or you can just incline the tree. And those 3 methods will introduce movement if that's what you're going for in your design. Wiring movement into young stems is nice because you get the movement that you want almost immediately. One of the downsides though is that tight bends, you really have to crank them down because as the stem thickens, the inside of the curve kind of gets washed out. So these pictures are the same tree. And you can see that movement that I put into that new leader looks a lot more severe on the younger stem, doesn't it? Yep, and that's just growing out, and it softened it up like that. So wiring is a double-edged sword because the young stems, you really have to wire them a lot. And it's difficult to not get the wire to bite in and to wire it enough so that you see movement. It's definitely possible, but you just have to, I'd say you have to check on it every week in the growing season. Cutting, doing cutbacks to get movement that induces a directional change it works well, but you have to do it young so that the scars aren't too severe. But it gives you the advantage that it also introduces taper. And then you can also use wire to kind of enhance it, but you don't have to bend it so severely and risk the scars so much. All right, so another big topic is healing scars. So even if you do everything, perfect, which won't happen, you're going to deal with healing some scars. So it's a big topic. And we can aid our trees in closing cuts to appear more seamless using several techniques. And I recommend making large cuts during the growing season. I know a lot of people recommend in the fall, which I haven't had good luck with, and I've read physiology books and stuff, and the cambial growth does start to shut down in the fall, so I've gotten way better results during the growing season. I have been in situations where I still do it in the fall, but it's not like my go-to move personally. Let's see. So whenever possible, you should have a lower branch below a big cut, and you'll really limit the chances of dieback. And then you'll also actually increase the time, decrease the time that it takes to close, because a lot of time what happens, I don't know if those with more experience have noticed that the bottom of a scar heals really slow to the top. I haven't found a great explanation for that, but I've read some hand-wavy stuff that it's like how the tree flows nutrients from the leaves. Just a lot of it goes through that top part, and then there's almost some like hydrodynamics involved with the bottom part, where it doesn't so much, there's not so much growth, movement of nutrients through the bottom part. So if you can have a branch directly on the bottom, it'll heal up from the bottom way more than if you didn't. And it's not necessary. So a lot of my trees, including some of these, I won't have a back branch and I'll still cut it. It's just you may deal with some dieback. So here there's a picture of a river birch. And I put a little line because I wasn't sure how it would show up here, but you can see it died back all the way down there. And it's not really the end of the world because you just re-wound it. So here's another different river birch that I have. That wound was supposed to be, I think it was like 25% of the size originally, but it died back that much. And so I just re-wounded it to the dead, and you can see it's healing now. Let's see. And dieback is more of an issue on older trees too, because if you have a lot of dieback on a mature trunk and then you try to heal the scar, then all the new cambium that grows is going to have a big mismatch. So that's why it's good to kind of get all this stuff out of the way while the tree is younger. Another thing is that trees do lose vigor as they age, so it'll take longer for them to heal. And larger, so we have the concave cutter. So I know when I started bonsai, I thought, well, the concave cutter is concave. So every cut I do, I want to make concave. Well, that's not actually true. So these larger cuts, you actually want to make them convex because of how the cambium rolls in and the scar tissue rolls up. It'll help like kick out the scar tissue, towards the end of the closure. And you can either accomplish this by carving the wood, but that takes a long time. So I've started using epoxy putty. I think I mostly use it's called like water weld or JB weld, water weld. But I've used a few different ones and they all seem to work the same. It's just like a 2-part putty and you mix it together. And wounds will heal over them, and it seems to work great during the growing season. Branches near large wounds also can aid in closing them. But one thing we want to be careful of is that we're keeping the branch in the final design, because I've seen a lot of wounds where people are like, yeah, branches are good next to wounds, but then they cut them all off, and then there's just like this nasty area of just a bunch of scars. So it's only helpful if the branch is going to stay there. But it does help a lot if you can have a branch in the area that's going to stay. Like I would say it speeds up by like 50% in some cases. And then I know there's like a controversy on cut paste. I'm a pro cut paste. I don't think, I've seen a lot of people quote like what arborists do and stuff. And an arborist isn't even going to notice if their landscape tree dies back 1/4 inch. But we will on our bonsai, right? So I definitely don't think that research that's quoted in that is applicable to bonsai. And I see a big difference between using cut paste and not. One thing I've learned this last year that I've really been making some moves is that the scar tissue, the cambium doesn't like to form over a cracked substrate, dried or decayed, things like that. And the wound sealant really helps with that, as well as protecting it from pathogens. And there's 2 kinds of cut pastes that I usually use. One is the Japanese is Kirakuchi, and they say it has this hormone in it, gibberellic acid, that aids in healing. I don't know what it has in it because I've researched gibberellic acid and it doesn't say it doesn't induce healing in trees, at least per my research. But it could have something in it. But I like that it's like paintable. So I just get a paintbrush and then I can do a lot really quickly. I have found that polymer one does work good at keeping the wounds moist. But for me, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword because it's so sticky that I've had it rip off calluses that have formed when I just lift it to check. So I've kind of steered away from that. I have a question for you guys, though. Have you ever seen a tree that has the aluminum foil on the scars? Does anybody know why they do that? I don't either. That was an actual question. I was trying to research it for this topic, and I can find pictures of, Japanese growers doing that, but I couldn't find any answers. It looked kind of cool, though, so I was like, maybe I'll try it. All right. Talked about everything there. Okay, so now we're done with the trunk, and we'll move on to the canopy. So deciduous trees are like light collecting machines, they're very efficient at it. They don't really form pads, is one concept to keep in mind. They're trying to occupy all of the space. So there is no pad in a deciduous tree. That's just not how they grow. And I personally really like to study mature trees. And I know Mike recently had an article kind of on the same topic about studying the cottonwoods that I enjoyed. I really like to go to arboretums and just look at how the trees are actually growing And then because there's no like houses and stuff, they're minimally pruned, so you can actually see what the natural structure of the tree is. So spend a good bit of time wandering around the National Arboretum, the actual Arboretum part, and seeing some cool trees. So here's a Zelkova. One of the cool things I think about Zelkova is they actually do like grow like a broom style. And I've seen other ones too. So they actually grow how the traditional way to style them is. Here's a Dawn Redwood. I've never seen a Dawn Redwood somebody styled like that, where it has like the conifer kind of conical shape, but the branch structure is completely different. And there's an old one there that looks the same. So I'm trying one now. My wife bid on it at the PBE for $13. It was like a bidding war, but it's starting to look pretty good. So I'm wondering how it will read though, because sometimes you can't, it just doesn't translate in bonsai, but we'll see, it'll be fun. It's coming out pretty good. Here's another very common one, a Chinese elm. So that's like a real Chinese elm canopy. That's how they actually grow. And then here's a American beech. And this is actually in the whole arboretum that I've seen, which isn't all of it. I think it's like 400 acres. But this is my favorite tree that I've found there. It's a red maple. So what we can kind of see from studying all these is that deciduous canopies for most species tend to form like a vase or an oval shape. The internal structure is best described as organized chaos. The central stem of most of the species tends to split, as we've already discussed, at some point, creating that decurrent structure, or in the case of this tree, they'll just have a really dominant branch that's kind of somewhere between a trunk and a branch. And then mature branches in most species grow at upward angles, even at maturity. And the angle increases as you go up the tree. And the branches of most deciduous trees tend to grow up, then go down, and then go up again at the tip. This is another big branch on that tree that you can't see in that picture. The crown of the trees is formed by several branches that kind of dance around each other to the end, which is a little different than a typical conifer. And again, it's important to remember that these are guidelines from studying natural trees, and that whatever story you picked for your bonsai can change this. Yeah, again, trees don't know rules. I did look at the bonsai there too, but mostly I did spend, it was 50-50, and I kind of like studying natural trees more, because if you study a lot of bonsai, then you'll kind of like recreate what you've seen. So I like to study bonsai, but I also, it's a rare opportunity to see so many trees in their natural form. Okay, so deciduous trees must be wired when they're young, and this is a big difference between conifers and a lot of tropicals. A lot of those you can put big bins into really old wood. It's just not possible in deciduous. So if you want movement, you have to add it early on with wire, or you have to resort to the cutbacks. With our trees, we tend to wire the structural elements and then use clip and grow, because wiring takes a long time. So kind of do what you need. And even when I was in Oregon, a lot of people didn't fully wire their trees for the shows unless it was a show tree. And then other than that, it was kind of like maintenance wiring. And then like that hornbeam, I think, or not hornbeam, the hawthorn that Dennis Wojtyła had, I think he spent a full 2 weeks wiring every single branch on that before the show that he won. and that was with some helpers. So you can imagine you don't want to be doing that all the time. Let's see, for developing the interior branching, a taper and ramification, it's best to prune back twice a year, I've found, to avoid the dieback of the interior buds. And then this also helps you build scar tissue for a more resilient design when your tree's in refinement, and we'll talk about that later. And if you leave the branches on too long, again, you'll lose buds on the inside of the branch, or branches will die. Definitely happened to me before. So here I'm just pointing out areas where we wired that tree, and then everything that I don't point out was just clip and grow. So it's kind of like that branch with the arrow on the right, that one's actually below the other one, and that was wired. So you're kind of wiring in that space, and then using clip and grow beyond that. You can obviously wire everything if you want to, but just take a long time. So you can add branches, and this is a cool thing about deciduous, is you can use grafting. You can use thread grafts or approach grafts. These are both thread grafts. So the Washington hawthorn, I just did those like a week ago. But this red maple, that one's about 7 months old, so you can see kind of what it looks like when it's about to fuse. The grafts typically take 1 to 2 years before they fuse, and you can really tell when they've fused because the exit part of the graft will start to be more thick than the entry, and so that tells you that it's contributing to the tree, therefore it's fused. So that's a good indicator of cutting it off. Success is much more difficult with a mature tree, because you can imagine if you have like a mostly done canopy, it's really hard to get light on the thread grafts, is one thing I've struggled with. Another thing that I've found is when the trees are barked, it's really hard to thread graft, because the bark is dead tissue, and then you're trying to get it to fuse with this live thing. Well, it's going to constrict itself around the dead tissue, and then it will just die, the thread graft. So this year, I've tried a couple of thread grafts where I strip off the bark and then do the thread graft. So we'll see if that works. See, for both development and refinement, it's best to prune deciduous trees in the spring after the first flush has hardened off. And for the new people, hardening off means that it's formed like a waxy cuticle. So when the leaf first forms, it will kind of look dull. And then once it's formed its cuticle, there'll be kind of a sheen to it. And that's a wax coating that protects it from moisture loss. The latter part of summer is also good, but you have to be careful, because when you prune it, you'll trigger it to do another flush. So you want to time that pruning so that it's early enough in the summer that you don't lose that flush when the first frost hits. So I've found for us, if I prune either the first week or second week of August, it seems to harden off in time for the first freeze. But it's Colorado, so we might have a first freeze in like September 1st. So gotta be careful. Okay, so when should a tree enter refinement? I think that's a tricky question, but I kind of consider it to be it should enter refinement when you're mostly happy with the thickness of the trunk and the primary branching, and the secondary branching is in place. Because then at that point, you really want to start building ramification. You want to preserve the taper that you've developed. So at that point, it'll be detrimental to leave it in a bigger pot. And then at that point, the goal also is to reduce the internode length for your twigging. So you kind of want to constrain the resources that the tree has access to. And then when it enters into refinement, you can also space out the repotting a little bit. It is important not to rush a deciduous tree into a bonsai container. Probably this is for all bonsai. And this is the number one thing that I see people do. A lot of times people will ask me, what do you think I should do with this tree? And they have it in a bonsai pot, but it's like 10 years away from being show ready. So I'll say, put in a bigger pot. But it's a hard answer to hear though sometimes, because you have that nice now pot or something and it's just burning a hole in your pocket. But you're really hurting the development if you do that. But having said that, it's also important to get trees into a bonsai pot. And I have seen a couple of those where people waited too late and it was like a refined tree that was too vigorous, essentially. Let's see. So refinement is pretty simple overall. I mean, it revolves around disciplined and timely pruning, and that's mostly it. And then you're managing the strength of the tree. So in spring, once the first several leaves have hardened off, the tree should be pruned back to 1 or 2 buds for most species. I have found this doesn't work good for elms though, because elms are like so vigorous. If you have like 10 buds on a branch, usually all 10 of them will leaf out in the spring. And so if you cut back an elm like this, it almost creates like witches' brooms like all throughout the tree, because they also backbud so profusely that you don't get enough spacing between the branches. So I'm sure there's other species out there, but elms I would recommend being like, okay, you kind of have to think like, okay, I want some length here, so I'm going to prune out over here. Versus other species, you can kind of just be like, all right, prune back to 1 or 2, depending on how much energy I want it to have. And then again, this process is repeated until that first or second week of August. Let's see. And then pruning back to 1 or 2 buds also creates more scar tissue, which will help you create a resilient design. And then pruning back to 1 or 2, usually what I do is I prune back to 2 if I want something to keep gaining in strength and keep gaining in ramification. And if it's a piece that's outcompeting other parts, then I'll prune it back to one bud. And that seemed to work pretty well. Eventually, a refined deciduous tree will need to have its canopy reduced. As each year, it kind of grows out a little bit, you can imagine. So eventually, the volume of the canopy will start to look out of proportion with the rest of the tree. And that's another thing. I would say that's a big topic in refinement, is managing that and not killing off interior branches and keeping the tree. If you have a medium tree, keeping it a medium tree. If you have a shohin, keeping it a shohin. And I'm not too much of a shohin guy, but I've heard that even a shohin, eventually they'll have to become a medium bonsai, because I've heard that you start to get too many like scars and stuff. I don't know if that's true or not, but so that's where all that scar tissue that I've been talking about developing comes into play. When you're in refinement, you always want to be thinking about, where could I cut this branch back to when I need to reduce the size of the tree? So that's what these arrows are pointing out, is maybe those bigger pieces. At some point, I'm going to have to cut the tree back to those smaller pieces to keep it a medium tree. And so if you just develop the branches in a few years, this is where a lot of people kind of don't have resilient trees, is if you build the branches too quick, then you don't have any scar tissue. And then for the new people, scar tissue is meristematic tissue for trees, which is kind of the equivalent of stem cells for humans. So when you cut back and you expose the scar tissue to light, you can actually get buds forming there, even though there was never a bud there. The last refinement technique is outer canopy foliar reduction. It's kind of related, but it's about keeping the interior of the branches strong, because I've just talked about how eventually you're going to need those interior branches. So if you just let them die, then your design becomes less resilient because you don't have anything to cut back to. So when the outer canopy becomes dense enough that you notice the inner branches become weak, you can thin the canopy by either trimming off half of the leaves, like literally cut the leaf in half of the outer ones, or you can just completely remove the leaves, leaving the interior ones. And then you let light into all those interior ones, and it triggers hormonal changes in the tree, and the tree's like, okay, I'm not going to kill off all this interior stuff that wasn't doing anything for me, a week ago. Now it's working great, so I'm going to leave that. Let's see. The day-to-day care of trees in refinement does change fairly considerably, and most changes are aimed at reducing the inner node and reducing the leaf size. And then, again, I keep reminding myself that there's some newer people here. So inner node is like the space between the leaves. So in a tree, you want that, and if you're trying to make a small tree look like a big tree, you want that to be very small. And most of the changes in your care are aimed at reducing that inner node and then reducing the leaf size. So the fertilizer frequency and concentration should be lowered to help reduce the inner node size, and it'll also help reduce the leaf size. Watering. So now on these trees, I kind of just water them, and if they get a lot wet, then that's good, and I move on. But the ones in refinement, if you overwater them, then you're going to create a larger inner node and bigger leaves. So when they're in refinement, you really want to be watering on an as-need schedule as much as possible. Everybody's got their responsibilities in life, but if it's the weekend and you're like, this one doesn't need water, I could maybe water it tonight or something, and it'd be fine, then that will help your tree develop shorter inner nodes and smaller leaves. Full sun exposure also is even more critical, because full sun leaves are smaller than shade leaves. So you want to expose the tree to full sun to get the leaves as small as possible. And this can also be confusing for people, because like if you visit I don't know, Andrew Robson, just because he's coming to actually visit us. So if you visit his garden, I know he puts up shade cloth at some point. So that could be confusing, because you'd be like, oh, well, I should put up shade cloth. But he actually puts up shade cloth after the leaves have already hardened and they're already small. Then he puts up shade cloth. So he's already achieved like the full sun sized small leaf, and then he protects them after that point. And then, shade also induces longer inner nodes because the trees are really smart. There's a book, I've read a decent bit of it, but it's all about how plants respond to light. And they can actually tell if they're being blocked by like a solid object or another plant based on the spectra of light. So when they get shaded, when they get less than full sun, they'll stretch out the distance between their leaves, reaching for full sun. So we want to avoid that. And this is why shohin trees are pretty tricky to grow, because if you get like one long internode, you could be done. So I think shohins is difficult. But anyway, thank you. And want to take any questions you have, or have all these trees up here, welcome to come look at. Okay.
My question, you mentioned concave cutters, convex scars, the interior below the cave. How do you get a convex shape to the interior of that scar?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I use a Dremel tool, and then they sell some special bonsai bits that you can do that with, or you can just get some from Home Depot. That's one way. I have, because yeah, you're making a little sculpture. That does take a long time. Like we have 150 trees that we're developing, so that's why I moved more towards the epoxy putty, because it's way more expedient. That answer? Oh, and the question was, how do you, because I have to repeat it, right? Do I still have to repeat it? How do you make a cut convex was the question. Okay, and then we had another question right there. Well, right next to you.
Yeah, I was wondering, I have an elm that I was trying to keep alive in the winter, and I've heard that the temperature that applies to the trees mostly having to do with the root ball, having to keep the roots cool and keep them dormant, that sort of thing. When we had these really cold, like negative days, like for a few days at a time, I would bring it in and I'd just kind of do a redneck solution. I'd like put ice around the root balls or things like that, but I wouldn't have much control of the top stem. Does that matter? Like, do the same principles apply to deciduous trees, just to focus on the roots, or is there more technique there that you recommend?
Right, so the question is, should you keep the roots cool when you bring it inside? Is that?
And is there a difference with the importance of the root versus
Oh, okay. And is there a difference, then the second part of the question is there a difference between the root cold hardiness and the canopy, correct? Okay, yeah, there's a huge difference. So I've even read that in that research I was referencing, I've read all of it, and I don't remember the exact number, but I want to say there was some species that they studied, that has been studied before, where the difference was like 100 degrees Fahrenheit between the stem and the root hardiness. So these roots are way less cold hardy than any of the stems, because if you just think about how the tree evolved, it's always getting hit by the wind, whatever the environment sees, it's getting hit by that solar radiation I talked about, it's losing heat every night. But the roots, they're on a mature tree, it's connected to tons of earth that's just staying pretty much the same temperature. There's no wind. So it's really the roots that you're trying to protect in most species. It is species dependent though. There's some tropicals that the stems will die at 40 degrees. And then the question on the ice. So were you asking, was that a good idea to put the ice?
Like, is there any known damage that will occur if, for example, you bring a tree in and have to keep it in and you try to keep the roots cool?
No, I think that's a good idea because, like I said in the talk, that at 41 they start to lose cold hardiness. So like you want to bring them in for those days, but you don't want to keep babying the tree inside, so you want to bring it out. So I think it's a good idea. The top will care less, but the top can tell the temperature, but that's something that I'm not too educated on. So you still want to get it out into the cold as soon as possible, but the roots can lose their cold hardiness very quickly they would, and it's almost completely gone when it reaches 60. So if you keep your house at like, 66 or something, then it's gone. So I think the ice is a good idea. And then we had a,
Yeah, I'm curious about, with most bonsai, even in addition to the deciduous, are greenhouses a bad idea because it doesn't allow them to go into dormancy?
no. So all these trees are grown in a greenhouse. I just didn't talk about it because, we're lucky that we have a greenhouse. So I don't want to assume that everybody has a greenhouse. But what will happen is they will leaf out early. So like from talking to Matt, it sounds we have some of the same species, and mine are a little bit ahead of his because his have been in an unheated garage and mine have been in a greenhouse. So you will need to manage the temperature in the greenhouse, and especially if the greenhouse is in full sun, like ours are in full sun. So if you, even on a winter day, because I was building it, during winter at some points, even when it's 20 outside, it'll get up to like 120 in the greenhouse. So that's the main thing. If you don't have vents and the greenhouse is in full sun, then your trees will leaf out really early, and it'll be a big struggle, even with some basic heating. So greenhouses is its own topic, but the cooling is almost as important as the heating. But greenhouse is definitely a great tool. Like I love greenhouse.
Is there a temperature range that's a good temperature to keep them in the winter?
Yeah, so if you could keep them at 40 degrees all winter, that would be optimal.
Okay.
But that's probably not going to happen. So like our greenhouse gets down to like 20, 23. I think the lowest it's ever gotten is 21.9, and everything's fine. But just the question is, what temperature would I like it to be? Yeah, I'd like it to be 40 until April, but it's not going to happen. But yeah, really, you want to keep it as close to 41 as you can. So like in the winter, I also put shade cloth over the greenhouse just to lessen the solar load, and then I probably will remove it next week. Yeah. Answer the question? Okay.
So you had a picture with mulching, and you actually mulch over the top surface of the soil. How deep do you mulch it, and then how often do you water them in the wintertime?
Okay, so the question is, showed a mulch picture. How deep do I make the mulch over the top of the soil? And then how often do I water them? So you all have more experience with that overwintering trees. So honestly, I just mostly copy what you tell me. So I water them every 2 weeks to a month, just check on them. That seems to be what everybody told me they do. And then the mulching, I'm really just concerned about that solar radiation aspect, because I don't know if you saw my structure that I made, but one side of it is open, so it still can see. So I just make it like a couple inches, enough so that it won't blow away, and it shields the top surface. What do you?
It doesn't get down into the soil. What kind of mulch you use, I guess?
I get it at the landscape store. It's called like, I'm bad at that. Christian would know. I think it's called like gorilla hair or something, some weird name like that. Does that sound familiar?
Coconut husk, will that work?
Yeah. What do you do? How deep do you do your mulch?
I don't put mulch over the top. That's why I asked.
Okay, yeah.
And I'd like to check the soil before I water.
Yeah. So my thought process is just the minimal amount to block the radiation loss.
Can I say a word about the gorilla hair?
Sure.
People like it because it sticks together, pieces stick together. I don't really understand the fibrous structure. It just doesn't blow away as easily as the bark.
Oh, okay. That's
the point. It just stays where you put it.
That makes sense. Like a lot of times I just rely on the experts. So I think we asked what blows away least, and that's kind of what they recommended. So that makes sense.
Another thing you can use too is like pine needles. So like we have some pretty big ponderosa and Austrian pines, and I'll create and that'll turn into almost a blanket.
Oh, nice.
Draped up, and then you can put it over, and then it's free. You don't have to buy it.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I like that idea. And then we take a trailer to get the mulch, and that's, it takes hours. So is there,
You're talking about styling and abstract versus realistic. How much does, when you're selecting the free bonsai material, is the decision made already in the material, or is it you, or is it a combination of both? What's your process?
okay, so the question is abstract versus realistic when you're buying pre-bonsai material that's had some styling perhaps before? Maybe not. What do you do if it's a style that you don't like or like?
How much is the material decide?
Oh, how much does the material decide? Okay.
Versus how much you're deciding?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That's a great question. I actually had that in there, but I mean, as you can tell, it was a good bit of talking, so I kind of cut down on some of it. And that's one thing that I've done myself, and I've seen other people do, is you purchase some material, you spend a lot of money on it, and then you try to make it something that it's not. So that's what I would recommend not doing. So if you have a tree, like I said, that tree, I'm not sure if you saw my hornbeam at the show, but it was very much styled in a Japanese way. And I could have, it didn't have much in the way of branching ramification. I could have been like, oh, I want all these branches to be upward sweeping. I want it to be decurrent. I'm just going to cut everything off. But again, that's kind of that same mindset. So I would say just know what you're buying. So if the material that you're thinking about buying is more of abstract, then that should be your goal, is to continue, in my opinion, should be to continue that versus start over. Because I have had some trees that I've tried to turn them into something that the original artist didn't intend, and you're just battling it for years and years. So I would say the material definitely dictates, if you're buying something more mature, the material, in my opinion, should dictate somewhat of the style. It is a fun process to buy something that is more established, because it almost uses a different part of your brain. Because if you start something from the beginning, you're the designer, you decide everything. But it's kind of remodeling a house and working with what you have versus tearing down the whole house. So you have to kind of work inside of a box. So, no problem. Any more? All right.
Can you maybe go back in some of the pictures or some of the examples you have there? How old are those cuts? Just know how fast.
Yeah, sure. So question is, can I go over some of the cuts and know how old, and describe how old they are, so we can see how fast the healing has occurred? It might move, okay. So this one, I don't think I mentioned this, but you can see where it has two scars. So at one point, the scar tissue that it was developing died back because it dried out. And that's this is the main tree that taught me that. So at that point, that was 2 years old, and now the tissue that's formed over it is 1 year old. And that I know because it's how long we've had our house, which is 3 years, because it got damaged on that move. And then let's go to some other ones. This is a Dawn redwood. They heal incredibly fast, at least with the young tree. That's only 1 year old. And again, though, it has a branch directly below the scar, and I have found that drastically helps. So this one is 1.5 years old. And this is a good question though, because the scars also heal way faster when the trees are young. There is some, just like us, like our cell division slows down as we age. Actually, the same thing happens with trees. So like if you can do the big cuts earlier on, like that's something that I learned. Like I got a like a more affordable Telperian tree at one point, and I'm just every time I see it, I'm like, I should have just spent $200 more because I'm trying to heal these scars that it's probably going to take like 20 years to close them because the tree was so old and it needed the attention 10 years before I got it, kind of thing. I don't think this one, that's 3 months. It may be hard to see where it's healing, but that one's only 3 months because I had to re-wound it. It did the dieback thing. I think that's all. So kind of give you an idea?
So I keep a lot of my deciduous in the garage over winter, and then sometimes they'll start budding out early. Is there a way that you can kind of slowly transition them to like a more full sun, or are you just kind of out of luck and have to keep them in like a filtered shape over here?
Okay, so the question is someone's growing their trees in the garage, they start to leaf out. Is there a way to slowly transition them out so that the leaves don't get damaged in the full sun? So yeah, there is a way. So once it starts forming new leaves, those new leaves will be built for the new conditions. So you can put them out in an intermediate level and then slowly take it out into the full sun. And it's kind of driven by, you have to pay attention to the growth of the tree. So the old leaves, they're always going to be built for like the other condition, but then the new ones are the ones that will help you. But the old leaves can help you because they'll shade out the shade leaves, you know what I mean? So you can do that. And then if you have a window and you have grow lights, like Paul Koenig has a great indoor presentation, but if I'm not saying to go that, I think his like light rack like moves and stuff. I'm not saying go to that extreme, but if you could have a big, nice grow light, that would help. Because you know, you're increasing, even though it's nothing fancy, you're still increasing the amount of light that it's getting. Other things you can do is you can also keep it on like a cooler portion of the garage. You know, like if you have a wall that's not adjacent to the heated part, and that could kind of slow it down a little bit. Cool. Anything else from anyone? Right.
You mentioned earlier about using soil that has higher moisture retention. Do you do that with added organic matter, or how do you change soil?
Okay, so the question is, I mentioned more moisture retentive soil, and how do I do it with more organic material or what? Yeah, I do it with more organic material. In all of my developing trees, those are all just regular potting soil spliced with perlite. So in the Pacific Northwest, most people do 50-50. So I'm doing about 60-40 organic. And then the same thing for trees that are developed with akadama. I use a little bit more akadama than what they would, by I'd say 10 to 20% more.
You're just using like a loam or peat-based potting soil?
Yeah, try to not, you know, the peat environmental impact, I do try to reduce that. So mostly I will buy like a test bag, and then it's mostly the texture that you're looking for. Because like if you buy a tree soil for a tree potting soil, usually if it says trees on it, usually it's not good for bonsai because it's going to have huge chunks of bark in it. So it's kind of counterintuitive. So a lot of times the stuff that's labeled potting soil will be more fine texture, which is what we want, because we really want the texture in our trees to kind of be added by the aggregate. In my case, it's perlite for the development, because like a huge piece of bark would be detrimental. So whenever you go look at to buy potting soil, in one of the pallets you'll find one that's opened, and just look at what the texture is like and see if it's kind of fine and no big chunks, and then that's the one to go for. Anyone else have any questions? Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks again, George.